Hi everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time today to join us in this discussion. And special thank you to our panelists for taking time from their busy schedules to share their insights with all of us. So the current market conditions pose those challenges and opportunities to business leaders in general, and of course, including security leaders. And so I'm excited to hear from today's panel their thoughts and their take. And let me start by quickly introducing our great panel for today. So first of all, we have Fazil Merchant, previously co-CEO at Tanium, CFO at DreamWorks, and also currently sitting on the board of both public and private companies, including Warner Brothers, Raymond, and more. We also have Ryan Crum, Chief Information Security Officer at Apollo Global Management, and David D'Amato, Global Chief Information Security at Aon. So with introductions out of the way, let me jump right into it. We're going to have 30 minutes of a discussion, and you can write your questions in the chat, and I'll add them and ask them throughout the session and bring them to the panel. So with that, let's get started. And I'll start with you, Fazal. So you are currently sitting on the boards of organizations, including, like I mentioned before, Warner Brothers and Discovery and many others. What is the board focused on as it relates to current market environment, and how and if does that impact security leaders and their teams?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll start with, I guess, the market environment as a backdrop, because that kind of sets the stage for everything else. The unfortunate reality is it's just not that pretty, and you don't have to look too far into the news to see all the rhetoric around inflation concerns and recession fears and revenue declines, et cetera. And unfortunately, what happens in that environment is kind of the long tail ROIs start to matter a lot less than immediate savings through cost cutting and spending freezes. And often those are sort of broad based. And low-hanging fruit can sometimes be defined as the blatantly obvious excesses, but also the misunderstood necessities. And I think that's where education becomes key for the board, and ideally education by the CIO, the CTO, the CISO. Boards know they have a major risk exposure here. You'll even usually see it referred to in their risk factors that are published as part of their quarterly and annual filings. But the reality is the complexity of what the CISOs deal with and the fluidity of it in terms of how fast the environment changes isn't typically in the wheelhouse of most board members. Just look at their profiles. You see a lot of finance people, a lot of marketing people, a lot of operations people, but not folks always well-versed in corporate technology. And I think that's where education becomes key, and it has to be done in a way that lands. I've seen it done too high a level, and I've seen it go way down into the weeds and get lost in alphabet soup, which is not helpful. And aside from that, I'd say, keep in mind at the end of the day, what the board needs through repetition is really just four things. They want to know, what are the KPIs? Why do those KPIs matter? How do they comp? And how are they trending? And then if you have a clear plan around that, and the required investment, that can honestly be the difference between having the capital to do what's required and not get caught in kind of arbitrary budgetary cuts, and being able to actually deliver on your plan without suffering the implications of the consequences.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And Ryan, to you now, as a CISO, what challenges do you see and are you facing during this current economic climate? And do you feel any impact? Are there steps you're taking to prepare for what's ahead with your team?
Yeah, well, I would like to thank you for having me as well. But kind of want to echo Fazal's point, right? Which is, I think, in any market economy, whether it be upturn or downturn, I think you as a CISO need to make sure that you're justifying your program, your tool spend, your people spend, and tying it back to some type of a metric or business, right? What's the so what of why you're spending on X, right? I think that behooves you to do that on downturns as much as an upturn. One of the key things that I've found successful is, even during the upturn, showing that you are fiscally responsible as a CISO, right? Even when you have flush money, there is a limit for how much cybersecurity can change in an organization through IT. If IT or technology's main vision is to deploy apps for the business and enable the business, security can't be taking a big chunk of that away from the delivery of that capability. Right. And so what you're going to see now, you're going to see cut back on projects. But if you can be creative in terms of looking at the projects you really have invested over the years and saying, how effective are they? What's the cost for this? You might have put in something a couple of years ago, you don't love it, but it's kind of there. Maybe you go back and revisit that and save some of that money to fund a better initiative, right? And some might say that, well, that's the risk-based approach to it, right? But look at the risks you have, look at the controls you have, mitigating those risks or reducing those risks and figuring out which ones you really need to prioritize. And I think if you take that approach in any economy, you're going to be much better off than just spending freewheeling.
Interesting. David, would you agree? Are you doing anything different, or do you also agree that if you're always mindful of spend even when flushed, then there's not a lot that changed during this climate?
Yeah, it's about having those conversations early on, right? So the last thing you want is to be talking now about the value that the team's been adding. So I think to both Ryan's and Fazl's point, it's one, understanding your audience. In a lot of cases, it's a non-technical leader, and you should be educating them, working with them, and helping them understand exactly what the program's doing, how it's doing, how you're measuring it. All of these things have to be done up front, because if you're now rushing to demonstrate value, it's probably too late at the end of the day. And then the other area, I think, is thinking about like risk appetite, which is, in my opinion, a contract with your senior leadership to understand how much security do you want? What are the acceptable risks that you're willing to tolerate at a high level? So do you want to have a breach frequently? Do you want to have it infrequently? How many data records can it expose? And that helps drive the amount of investment you need. Because honestly, like my past, I worked at a cryptocurrency company, right? Tolerance for risk was very low, right? You couldn't have an incident. But if you work for a different company, maybe it's something in retail, there may be a higher sort of risk appetite for that as well. So it's understanding it's not only driving, describing the value that you're bringing, but also working out that contract with leadership to show them that you're being fiscally responsible, understanding how much security that you need for your specific business.
Thank you for that. Fazal, back to you as a question. The Sequoia team talked about and published, really, I think, a letter that became almost famous by now to investors and to early companies at the beginning of what we now see as like the market shift at May of last year. And they talked about how many revolutionary companies were actually born during economic downturns, and that while the current market environment presents, of course, its challenges, it can also provide new opportunities. I'm wondering, what opportunities do you see for security leaders to kind of embrace in this as we prepare for 2023?
So I'll actually tie this back to broader than security and just business overall. This will resonate with Dave from our time together. But this is a bit sick and twisted, I guess, but these unstable, uncertain times, I actually love. And I love them because I believe amidst chaos is always opportunity. And I've been through, I'm going to age myself here, but I've been through a number of these sort of economic cycles. And what I found is when you have a fragmented market, which is what we have in our space, and you're facing economic challenges or an economic challenging environment, what ends up happening is the space tends to bifurcate into two broad categories. I'll call the consolidators and the to be consolidated. And capital becomes much more binary and starts to favor the consolidators. And so in the build versus buy equation, it can be a really opportune time to lean in to the buy side of the equation at really attractive valuations. And the question is, what are you buying? It can be any number of things. You can be buying talent, you can be buying IP, you can be buying revenue, you can be buying cash flow, you can be buying customers. You can even from a product perspective, you can be buying technology or fillers for product features or gaps that are easier, cheaper, quicker to buy now than to go build. And so this is the time where I think it can be really interesting for the consolidators in the space.
David, would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think it as an opportunity, right? There's maybe from more of like a CISO perspective, there's probably two big opportunities for me working in a 100-year-old global, professional services firm like Aon. The first is talent. So everyone right now is there's a lot of layoffs in the tech industry, a lot of great talent out there. And, Aon, which is a very stable 100-year-old company that's sort of embarking on a big transformation effort, is a very attractive place for some of those talented individuals to land. So for me, really focusing on how to acquire really great talent during this time frame. And then the second is a chance to renegotiate contracts and focus on consolidation of sort of the portfolio of items we have. And a lot of times in security, there's a lot of different things we can be doing, and we don't often think about what we should be doing. And so as there's sort of constraints on what we can get done, it's good to sort of reestablish, are we paying the right amount for certain products? Are we focused on and making investments in the right products and building those out? Because oftentimes we're looking at breadth instead of depth. So for me, it's really about refocusing the team on the right things that really matter with what we have the resources for.
Yeah, and I'm excited about consolidation as well, right? Like the more tools I can consolidate with the consolidators, right? And they can build a more comprehensive product instead of these one-off solutions that we continue to buy because the big player may not have it. The consolidation drives a lot of that simplicity in our environment, right? So it's actually not a bad thing to consolidate in this space.
So Ryan, if I can follow up to that, I mean, you've all mentioned consolidation, and I think it would be interesting for me to understand, when you say consolidation, how are you looking at it from the type of advantages that it brings? I mean, of course, a cost advantage, but like, how else are you looking at it when you look at your tool stack and when you think about solutions that can consolidate or consolidating your solutions? How are you thinking about that benefits? Because there's always this discussion in the market between best of breed to consolidating solutions to building your own type of aggregators. I think single pane of glass is a term we've all been using for like 15 years probably.
Yeah, it's a couple things, right? So number one, just talking about endpoints, right? Just start there, right? So endpoint consolidation, we've been talking about that for years, right? We all have 15 agents that run our security tools. Every time something goes bump of the night, it's one of those 15 tools. If I can get it down to 7, 5, 2, 3 for an endpoint, that's great. But you're starting to see a lot in the cloud stuff too, right? All these cloud tools that we need to connect. We need to have a connector, right? And there are all these other cloud tools that are connecting to other cloud tools to suck their data into it and process it, right? And it gets to be, you kind of have this explosion of data everywhere, right? About everything looking at your stuff, right? And also just eyes on screen, right? So you hire a couple analysts to look and maintain these tool sets. If they have to look at 5 different tools to get a good view of between vulnerability and between configuration and between inventory tools, right? That's why you end up building your own stuff, right? Because you don't have that one pane of glass, right? And so by consolidating some of those products into one space or buying a product that already has that consolidation, that is very helpful, right, for us. And that's when I talk about consolidation as being one of the benefits for us. And of course, cost and complexity, right? The more things you have, the more things that can break, and the more things that need to be patched, the more things that need to be paid for and negotiated and vendors managed, right? Like you just get all that stuff so you can kind of reduce that overhead of managing the fleet.
Yeah, thank you. David, do you see it the same way?
I do. It's simplification, right? I can't have every tool. There's no way we can operate and maintain that. And so finding the tools that satisfy the 80% and then either building or filling in the capabilities that we really think are important beyond that are incredible. The other thing that's extremely important from some of the platforms that we get is bringing engineering and security together in the same platform. So those two teams are typically, at odds with one another. There can be a little bit of friction in there. And so by working together in the same tool, by converging those groups into a similar tool, you get better participation and collaboration, which is always a benefit.
Yeah, I'll just add, I love something Dave said earlier about risk tolerance, because I've heard that discussion at boards numerous times. And I would say the less sophisticated ones talk about, full lockdowns, and that's great. And then the operations can't run. So there has to be a bit of a trade-off that takes place there. I'm skeptical. You mentioned best of breed. I'm always a little skeptical when I hear that because, best or beauty is in the eye of the beholder to some extent, and there are always various factions involved. As the market environment or the landscape changes or the threat landscape changes, what defines best changes as well. And so I think there has to be, I'm always skeptical when people say, oh, we're going to go best of breed. And in my mind, all I'm thinking about is, oh, great, now I've got structural complexity and inefficiency and a huge bunch of costs coming the way and a litany of tools. I think there has to be the powers that be have to get together and have a rational discussion about what they're trying to achieve and how to do it efficiently, as opposed to the sort of arbitrary go by the best of breed. That's a personal view.
No, thank you all. I definitely think that as we look at consolidation, like you said, it's a lot about the process, the simplicity. The end, you have people at the end of it, and I think, like David said, especially as we grow development teams to become more and more involved in security practices, that becomes even more important, right? You don't have a vulnerability team on the development side and another team for endpoint and another team. You have a process, you have one organization. So absolutely. Thank you all so much for it. I think, Fazal, if I can follow up to that, I mean, during those uncertain times, of course, as you also know from boards, companies look very carefully at new spendings. Do you have guidance for CISOs approaching their leadership, approaching boards on how to get to the budget and resources they need to be successful and how to partner closely with CFOs during those times?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's sort of like I said earlier, and Dave alluded to it as well. It's just education and communication. And if you have alignment around what the goals are and you have a plan laid in place, and there's an understanding of the consequences of not executing that plan and the implications of not executing that plan, companies don't get to where they are by being dumb. So it's easy to make broad-based sort of budgetary cuts and say we're cutting. And oftentimes it starts out this way, right? But we're cutting headcount 20% across the board, cutting spending 30% across the board. And then there's always the negotiation with a little bit of education and planning on the background to say, okay, well, something's going to be cut 10%, but something else is going to be cut 30%. And let's face it, to some extent, it's an internal battle against other functions in the organization, and you hope that the powers that be are looking at it more broadly. And so I think having clarity and alignment with the board on the back of an education of what you want to achieve, how you plan to achieve it, and what it's going to cost to get there. And once there's alignment on that, it's usually pretty sticky, because if you've educated right, what they also understand is the consequences of not following through. And so it comes down to communication and transparency.
But I want to add to that a little bit, though, because I think I've seen CISOs in this space, right, really get upset when they fail at communicating that, right? Or maybe a bigger priority project, right, got funded over there, super AI, whatever latest tool set was, because it's cool, and they didn't do a good job of selling that value, and they get so upset with it, and they end up being forced out because of the way that they handled that rejection, right? And so I think we have to remember that, the business still has to run. Everything can't be about security, and sometimes you're going to get a no. And I always like to tell the story of, like, when you're like trying to protect, like, the president, for example, like a Secret Service, they may want to go in the front door, and you're saying, well, no, it's very risky that way. I want you to go to the back door, but you have to make a decision on how do you protect that person or that project, even without that final resource, right? You can't get upset and say, oh my God, this company doesn't get it, right? And go on Twitter and start blasting them, and then you're out, right? Like, you're going to win some, you're going to lose some, and you have to figure out how do you prioritize and how do you communicate that value. To says, really, this is more important than the latest feature that we need to ship with or the latest business venture we're trying to get to, right?
Yeah, I think sometimes we take it personally. I think that's also the challenge, right? So we view it as our domain. It's something we own. We take it very personally. And that's why I think also when you use sort of that risk appetite approach, you're offering up options to leadership and saying, this is your business. And well, this is our business, but what's an acceptable risk to you, right? Here are the options that you have. You have to balance sort of running a profitable business and also the risks of security. And sometimes they're going to be, what you believe in. It's going to align with your opinion. Sometimes it won't. Hopefully it's not too much the other way, but you can't take it too personally. At the end of the day, everyone's looking out and making sure that we can run a proper business, we can keep people employed, we can continue to serve customers.
Yeah.
Just remember, sometimes there are broader issues that, others have a broader perspective on, and you're not seeing the whole picture. And so there's an important theme we used to have in a past life. We used to call it disagree and commit. You make your case, sometimes you disagree, and then you got to commit.
Couldn't agree more. And David, I think following up on your point about, just feelings being involved, I think in general, leaders during this time, regardless of the situation with the current company or your current team, there's a feeling of uncertainty. So how as leaders can you best support and lead companies and teams through uncertainty? Even if it's just a personal feeling of everybody waking up and opening Twitter these days.
Yeah, I think a couple of things. So one is communication. So what I like to do with all my teams is to keep really in close communication. There's weekly updates I write for my team, since it's a very large team. It's well over 100 people. And so making sure that everyone's sort of hearing my thoughts, what I'm reading, what I'm seeing in the industry, I think is incredibly important. I've had leaders who've done that in the past, both for security and non-security, which is incredibly helpful to understand the business that you're in. So that's one. And the other is just thinking about being, when we build solutions, making sure that we can adapt quickly. So whether that's investing in platforms that are API driven, investing in some engineering talent so that you have that balance of both buying and building and flexibility to adjust as changes come up, whether it's economic uncertainty or new types of threats, they just require you to sort of change course fairly quickly.
Ryan, any thoughts here?
I mean, what Dave said exactly, right? Communications, 100%. Any event you go through, whether it be an incident, right? You're in the middle of an incident, responding, right? Dave, we might have some experience with that in our past. Whether it be economic uncertainty with your company, with the business, right? Like people are always worried about themselves, and I think the more you communicate about what's going on, the closer your teams will feel. And I think you go back to the fundamentals, right? What's our mission? What are we doing? Making progress, right? Small iterative type things and updates, right? Kind of show them they're making progress, right? Like even with big projects, I think you can show small wins, right? And kind of celebrate those wins with the people. And kind of, I said, continue to communicate, right? And even helping translate even some of your senior messaging back to them, right? And it's lots of discussions.
Fazal, you've mentioned before, what lessons have you learned from previous economic downturns that really kind of shape your perspective on this one? And what are you approaching differently this time around based on that?
Not a whole lot. I'll tell you the one lesson I've learned that I will never forget is that liquidity is paramount. Because here's the thing, capital is usually there when you don't need it, and it is rarely there when you do. And there's no substitute for a healthy business and access to capital in times like this. That is often the delineation between the winners and the losers.
Strong advice.
Battle-scarred advice.
I love how you had it ready. Strong advice. Okay. I'd love to go, each of you, any kind of final closing thoughts on this, advice you give to fellow CISOs or people on security teams. David, starting with you.
Yeah, I honestly, I've just come in. It's my first 90 days here at Aon, and I have to say, my entire career, whether it was at Mandiant or as the first security hire at Tanium or elsewhere, it's always been focusing on the fundamentals. And if you can really prioritize and focus on the key fundamentals, whether that's misconfigurations, vulnerabilities, right? Strong two-factor authentication, network segmentation, these are the things that are always the issues that get people into trouble. And so, I know there's a lot of things to buy. There's a lot of shiny new objects and toys out there, but continuing to align with a standard framework and make sure that you have strong capabilities in those fundamental areas, I think are still incredibly important, the biggest factor to whether or not an organization has an issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just kind of echo that, right? When we buy companies, we often buy companies in the downturn environment, right? That's kind of how my company operates. And, back to that capital discussion, right? First thing we do is look at the basics on security. We don't ask them if they have any of these fancy tools. We say, do you have MFA? Do you have inventory, right? Are you looking at your configurations, right? Do you even know what you're protecting, right? Those are the kind of basic questions we ask everyone. And we just kind of the key things that are always important, right? So I think a lot of people, we used to joke at the old some of the old security conferences, and always these great new sexy new tools, and nobody has inventory. Nobody can tell you what the inventory is or how many machines they have, right? And so it's not the fun stuff. Like when you get engineers and you say, I'm going to hire you to run inventory, they think, oh, inventory, I thought we solved that years ago, right? And it's like, well, it's not just inventory, accounting. It's how many ports you have open, how many software packages you have, where do you have flawed port J? That all is an important part of your vulnerability program. That's not fun, but it's definitely a kind of a key pillar. So do those first, right, before you invest in any new. And if you have to double back down and go back and make sure that those things, you think you have those things, I guarantee you, go back and look, and those things aren't working like you think they're working.
Fasal, last but not least, any closing thoughts from you?
Yeah, I just, I'd go back to the theme on education and communication at this stage, take advantage of it. All the way up and down the chain, including up through, your CEO and into the board. Sometimes the audit committee is actually a great avenue to find the advocacy for that. If you can't get the airtime and the visibility at the board, because the audit committees generally have broad mandate over risk. And I'd say in this environment, look, you should always act as if your name's on the building, and get comfortable being a little uncomfortable, over communicate with the team, keep everybody focused on the things that actually really matter, because there's a whole lot of distractions that don't. So I call it staying within your sphere of influence, the things you can actually control and influence. The rest of it is just not worth obsessing over.
Thank you. And I thank all of you. And I love how we summarized on back to basics, communication, and liquidity. That's great advice for any crisis, I feel like. So thank you all so much for your time. And thank you everybody online for their questions. And thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.